Hey, welcome to our Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of the most famous stories of all time, the creation story from Genesis. Now, most of us feel like we know it pretty well, right? But what if I told you that one key detail, a single word, lost in translation, might just be hiding the real story, right there in plain sight? I mean, we all know the stories about the beginning of our world, but what if it's actually not about the creation of our physical planet at all? What if it's describing something totally different? Maybe even a world that came before this one. All right, first, let's just do a quick run-through of the version we all know and love. Over 6 days, God creates the world. You've got light, land, plants, animals, and then finally, humanity. It's this incredible poetic story about how everything began. And the common thinking, right, is that Genesis chapter 1 is all about God creating our physical planet from scratch, taking this total void, this absolute nothingness, and turning it into the world we see all around us. But if you look a little closer at the original language, a very different story starts to emerge. Okay, this is where it really gets fascinating. It turns out our entire modern understanding could be hanging on how we've translated just one single, really crucial word from the original Hebrew.
So that word we always translate as created is bara. Now, we hear create and we immediately think making something out of nothing, but its original meaning is actually a lot closer to organize. This isn't about making something from a void. It's about bringing order and structure to materials that were already there.
And that idea just completely reframes the whole concept of divine power, doesn't it? It suggests that the ultimate act of creation isn't just snapping your fingers and making things appear from thin air, but the incredible power of organization, the genius to shape and bring perfect order to what already exists.
So if create really means organize, and God wasn't making the physical world from nothing, what exactly was being organized back in Genesis chapter 1? Well, believe it or not, the text itself gives us a pretty surprising answer.
And this brings us to this really mind-bending idea. The creation actually happened in 2 main stages. We're all familiar with the temporal creation, the physical one. But before any of that happened, there was a spiritual creation, an organizing of these super-refined spiritual elements into a kind of pre-existent realm.
In fact, some versions of the text actually state this idea very clearly. God says He created everything spiritually before it ever existed physically, or, as it says here, naturally upon the face of the earth. You see what this means? The first chapter of Genesis, the one we all know, isn't the story of our physical world's birth. It's actually the story of the organization of a spirit earth, which was complete with spirit plants, spirit animals, and even the spirit forms of all humankind. So, with this new lens, this new perspective, let's go back and walk through those 6 famous days one more time and see what was really going on.
The 6-day process now looks a lot more like a blueprint, doesn't it? Every single step perfectly parallels the physical creation we know, but it's all happening on a spiritual plane first, using that refined spiritual matter.
So, on day 1, you have these pre-existing spiritual materials, which are described as waters, being gathered together and organized. Then, on day 2, those organized materials are divided by a firmament, basically creating the foundational structure for this new spiritual home. Day 3 is when we see spirit plant life emerge. And then on day 4, this brand new spirit planet gets placed into its own cosmic neighborhood with its own spiritual sun, moon, and stars. It just goes to show you, even a spiritual realm has structure and exists within a larger system.
And finally, on days 5 and 6, the spirit forms of all animal life were organized, everything from the creatures in the sea to the animals on the land. And then last, but definitely not least, the spiritual children of God, humankind, were brought forth to live in this amazing new spiritual world.
So why does this all matter? Why is this distinction between a spiritual and a physical creation such a big deal? Well, for one, it completely changes how we read the text, and honestly, it clears up some really old questions.
The main principle here is this 2-stage process. Everything that we see and touch physically was first imagined, designed, and organized spiritually. You could say the spiritual creation was the blueprint, and the temporal creation was the actual construction.
This whole idea also helps make sense of the Bible itself. You know how people have pointed out for centuries that the creation stories in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 seem a little bit different?
Well, if you see Genesis 1 as the spiritual creation and Genesis 2 as the start of the physical one, then just like scholar B.H. Roberts said, those contradictions just melt away. They're not contradictory. They're just describing two different phases of the same project.
Now here's one final, really helpful thing to remember when you're reading this. The texts don't always stop and say, hey, we're talking about the spiritual one now. Both the spiritual and the physical creations are often just called the earth, so you really have to look at the context to figure out which one is being discussed.
And that leaves us with one last pretty fascinating thought to chew on. If the creation of our entire world had this spiritual stage that came first, what else works that way? What other beginnings, maybe in our own lives, in our world, or in our own personal stories, might have a hidden spiritual chapter that we've never even stopped to consider? Thanks for joining us.